The U.S. is experiencing record inflation, standing at a 30-year high. Americans are paying more for cars, for clothes, food, and energy. And this is while there are other economies around the world, like China and the UK, who are also suffering from record inflation. Hi, I'm Kabatakwe. Stay tuned as we dive into the world of inflation, first in the U.S., then in other parts of the world. We're going to take a look at inflation rate in the U.S., 6.2% in October. It has risen compared to a year ago. That's the fastest annual increase in over 30 years. Americans are suffering as a result of that. Then we're going to take a look at possible reasons for inflation. Higher energy costs may be one, an increase of demand due to the post-COVID-19 period, also supply chain disruptions like the pork crisis. Then we're going to take a look at the spread of inflation, which seems to be a global phenomenon. The impact is being felt around the world. Price increases on basic commodities has occurred. China, UK, and Germany, three countries that are suffering as a result. How bad are other parts of the world?
As the reopening continues, bottlenecks, hiring difficulties, and other constraints could again prove to be greater and longer lasting than anticipated, posing upside risks to inflation.
Inflation that has not been seen in decades. That is the case in the U.S., standing at a 30-year high. This means that Americans are paying more for things like cars, clothes, food, and energy.
Well, when you think about it, we threw $5.4 trillion at the economy. That was about 20 to 25% of GDP. And that's going to be largely reflected in a combination of increased real growth and an increased price level. So yes, the price of goods and services post-COVID will be higher than the price of goods and services pre-COVID.
And here are increases on some everyday products in the U.S. Notice that many of them are in food items.
Definitely regular grocery stores like Giant, Harris Teeter's. Most of the prices for meat and vegetables have gone up.
I think that particularly like the meats, they've been inching up over the last few months. Gas prices today are ridiculous.
Inflation has hit low-income households especially hard because they shell out a larger share of their modest incomes to cover the necessities.
Gas prices are outrageous. They holding up all these boats in the water, they say, not letting them come in the port. But people are suffering, especially people in middle class and low class cannot afford to be paying gas prices of $4. Soon it'll be $4.
Some of the factors driving up the prices: higher energy and food prices, strong demand and supply chain disruptions following COVID-19, and a severe shortage of workers, which is driving up wages. Inflation is a serious problem that appears to be plaguing many parts of the world and in different sectors. Our first social media post points to the impact that inflation has had on the U.S. economy, and it's from Edward Snowden. Now, he has said inflation hits 6.2%, wiping out the raises of those lucky enough to even have a good job. Parents who are worried about the price of milk for their kids when the shelves are not empty and the establishment is like this. And we go to another post which said Americans are, by many measures, this from the New York Times, in a better financial position than they have been in many years. They also believe the economy is in terrible shape. Why? Well, let's see if we can get an answer to that question from that post. Vijay Varghese joins us. He's from roguenews.com. He's a contributor to Independent Precious Metals Authority. Vijay, welcome. So we just looked at that media post from Snowden saying that parents are worried about giving their kids milk. But then you have this schism where some think that the U.S. economy is doing well, yet others don't. Why is there such a contradiction here, do you think?
Well, that's a great question. And, I think one of the things that people need to understand is this. In order to understand where inflation is, you got to go back a few years, right? You got to go back to 1971. You got to go back to the 1980s, where we stopped calculating GDP numbers accurately, right? We re-engineered the way gross domestic product is measured. When we did that, we became the first country in the world where we counted government expenditure as part of GDP growth. Okay, so for the longest time, I mean, we've been running ridiculous numbers, and we were able to maintain quote unquote low inflation through accounting, gymnastics, trickery in arithmetic, falsifying data. The day, you know, the list goes on and on.
Okay, that's Vijay there. Interesting how he said gymnastics is being played with the numbers. That was the case for the U.S., but what about the rest of the world? Well, here are some economies whose inflation has hit the news recently. This particular tweet says that the U.S. consumer prices have risen at the fastest pace in 3 decades. China factory gate inflation has hit a 26-year high. UK inflation heading to its highest level in 10 years, and your neighbor still thinks that investing in Bitcoin is a bad idea. Well, that person has not taken a look at the Bitcoin numbers recently. Okay, in the UK, this tweet says inflation has hit 4.2%. That is the highest level in a decade and climbing. Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said, unless we get pay rises of 7%, the buying power of our earnings is going to be less this year than last year.
Yeah, I mean, this is the highest that inflation's been for almost exactly 10 years. And with the labour market strong, lots of people are moving into work, but earnings aren't rising this fast. Of course, we've got some big tax rises coming along in April. And all of this is going to mean, I'm afraid, that unless we're getting, once you take account of the tax rise, unless we're getting pay rises of something like 7%, I'm afraid the buying power of our earnings is going to be less this year than it was last.
Okay, let's bring in Alice, Sasha Craner. He's the founder of Craner Analytics and a trading advisor to quantitative strategies at CTA, who joins us. All right, Sasha, welcome. So we're looking at major economies around the world who are experiencing inflation, just like the U.S. is. And you're looking at China, for example, whose inflation has risen at 1.5% annual rate last month, which is double from the 0.7% of the annual rate that it experienced in September. Why is inflation going around the world at the rate that it is? What's going on here?
Well, basically, you know, most of the world today, perhaps the whole world today, has adopted this same monetary system, which today is purely based on fiat currency and essentially unrestricted possibility for monetary authorities to engage in monetary expansion. So basically, you have an uncontrolled rise in debt, which in the Western world has now exceeded about 300% debt to GDP. The debt has become unpayable. In the West, an estimated 20% of all corporations are now zombies, which means that they cannot even service the interest on their debts from their free cash flow. And increasing interest rates would essentially implode the system. All these corporate entities would probably collapse and go bankrupt. Most of the large global systemically important banks would also collapse. And so the policymakers' only option is to print money.
This is our Info News section where we take a look at other economic news making headlines or to have gone unnoticed from around the world. Our first story takes us to India. Who said protests don't pay off? It seems like in this case, it has. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has repealed farm laws after a year of protests. The repeal of what's called the Black Laws was designed to modernize agricultural sector. Well, that's a huge victory for the farmers. But why did Modi back off and take back the laws? That's the key question. We're going to find out, I'm sure, about that. Now let's go to a chip shortage. That's our next topic. It's still affecting the world, and in particular the car industry, which is not immune to it. And in particular in Europe, car sales there have plunged to their lowest level on record for the month of October. a 29% drop. Now, the drop comes due to continuous semiconductor supply shortages, not to mention COVID-19, of course. Have to wait and see whether this is going to, be provided or manufactured, but there are problems with the chip shortage in the world. The UK inflation is our next topic. This week, our program is about inflation, so it's a good thing that we're bringing this in here. A surge in container shipping rates, in particular, will continue well into the year 2022. Now, this came from the UN. Of all places, the UN has issued this warning. It says that freight costs will increase 11%. That's a 1.5% increase on consumer prices. So you can see that has translated from shipping costs to the consumer prices. And finally, the rich tax break. They're looking at a $285 billion tax cut for the rich that occurred under Trump. So it's a leftover from the previous U.S. administration. Now, at a time when inflation is hurting ordinary Americans and there is massive income inequality, taxes need to increase on the 1%, not to give them huge tax breaks. Our in-depth section is upon us, and we will look specifically at what is happening with inflation with a focus on the United States. First, let's define what inflation is. Well, in simple terms, inflation is a general increase in prices, and as a consequence, a fall in the purchasing value of the money or purchasing power. Then there is what's known as asset price inflation. Asset price inflation is when the price of assets rises and becomes inflated. Why would the prices become inflated? Well, low interest rates. When interest rates are low, investors cannot make easy returns using low-risk methods like government bonds or savings accounts. Well, in the last 18 months or so, we want to take a look at what the U.S. has done through the Federal Reserve. Well, it has pumped money. One source, and that's massive scale, has said $3 trillion. That's in 2020. And the American Central Bank obviously is the one responsible for that. And it did it to counter the economic impact of COVID-19. As a matter of fact, central banks have actually spent $834 million per hour for the past 18 months to save the global economy. Okay, whole lot of money there to save the global economy because of the pandemic. Well, it is economics 101 when it comes down to the money supply and when it expands. What happens as a result? It lowers the value of the currency. Now, when the currency declines, relative to the value of foreign currencies, the prices of imports rise. What happens then? Well, that increases prices when that happens in the general economy. So you can see the knock-on effects that were there. Well, at first, the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve downplayed the rising costs that were happening in the U.S., which led to inflation, record inflation. They argued that they were a temporary phenomenon driven by COVID-19's unprecedented impact on the global supply chain. They later backtracked on that.
We also know that as our economy has come roaring back, we've seen some price increases. Some folks have raised worries that this could be a sign of persistent inflation, but that's not our view. Our experts believe, and the data shows, that most of the price increases we've seen were expected and are expected to be temporary. Today's economic report showing unemployment continued to fall, but consumer prices remain too high. Tell us, the American people, in the midst of this economic crisis, the recovery is showing strong results, but not to them. They're still looking out there. Everything from a gallon of gas to a loaf of bread costs more.
Okay, you can see the differing views there as the time went by. Well, it's time to bring in a guest for this Q&A to see what he can tell us about inflation. Vijay Varghese from roguenews.com rejoins us. He's a contributor, independent Precious Metals Authority also. Okay, so what are we looking at here when it comes to the Biden administration saying that the rising costs, he downplayed it first, then he said that they have increased and have actually impacted and have remained longer in its duration. We're looking at the COVID-19, obviously, impact that this has had on the global supply chain, not to mention what is happening in the U.S. which has affected things like shelter, food, cars, among other things. What is going on?
Well, the whole thing is this. We're a country that makes nothing. Our biggest exports are trash and recyclables. And our real key export is the paper dollar. So in terms of a physical economy, we've been a country that has been gutting our physical economy for the last several decades. We, the leaders, the oligarchs of this country, sold the population on this idea of a service-based economy, or better known as a FIRE economy: finance, insurance, real estate. In other words, we've decided, the Wall Street banks have decided that it's much more profitable for them to have a purely speculative economy. So when a systemic shock like COVID-19 occurs, and it creates the type of supply chain issues, when it creates the type of capitalization issues, it's going to be catastrophic.
Well, let's see what you think, Sasha Craner. I mean, do you agree with our guest there? What he is saying is that the U.S. really is not going through a transitory period when it comes to inflation. It's something that's going to obviously, based on what he said, prolong in its duration. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think that both the government and the Federal Reserve have to talk down inflation, because they need to avoid the spectacle of people panic buying and bidding prices up because they're afraid of prices rising and they're afraid of shortages. But the reality is that the inflation will probably not be transitory. So this is just, let's call it what the Federal Reserve calls the moral suasion.
In January, we're expecting lots of referrals when the children return back to school for food parcels, emergency food parcels. So that number could increase again. I reckon it will increase drastically as the weeks go on.
今その牛乳だ、パンだ、ガソリンだ、ね、全部値上げになってるよね。でもこれぐらいの値上げだったら耐えられるんじゃないかなと思うね。だから。
फ़र्क तो बहुत आया है, जैसे कि हम हफ्ते के अंदर में बीच में काफ़ी बार नॉनवेज कर लेते थे, लेकिन अब वो नहीं हो रहा है। सिर्फ एक हफ्ते के अंदर, पूरे हफ्ते में एक बार ही नॉनवेज खाया जाता है।
Il est temps je vais dire d'intervenir dans une gestion des prix ou alors dans une aide vis-à-vis de l'État pour un petit peu aider tout ça, parce que je pense que ça va augmenter de plus en plus.
You can imagine the sales of some items, the cost of some items as at 2 weeks ago has increased with like 50% increase. We experience that increase almost every day.
The Fed is doing what the Fed always does, which is basically taking the movements in inflation on board and looking to make sure they do not get entrenched in the system. And this is the reason why the market is anticipating Fed rate hikes coming shortly after the Fed is completed with its quantitative tapering.
I think the conditions for this interest lift off, which is of interest to your audience, are pretty well spelt out in this forward guidance, which clearly under the current analysis are not satisfied and certainly not in the near future.
It looks like inflation is plaguing many parts of the world. Maybe the rich can weather out this storm, but the disadvantaged, they are going to have a hard time meeting their basic needs. We begin with the U.S., where inflation has reached 6.2%, a 30-year high. The disadvantaged are suffering as a result. These are the findings based on a recently published report. inflation will dampen the Christmas spirit for 10% of everyday people in the U.S. It's eating into recent wage increases. Struggling families spent a third of their earnings on essentials like food and energy. The timing couldn't be worse after federal pandemic relief expired for about 7.5 million Americans. Germany, the Eurozone economic powerhouse, is also suffering from record inflation. Inflation has soared to its highest levels in 3 decades, and many Germans are angry as their lives have become more uncertain.
Wo deutlich spürbar ist bei Gemüse, Obst und Gemüse. Und ein Stück weit auch bei Fleisch. Allerdings ist da der Sprung nicht so stark wie bei Obst und Gemüse.
Die und die Meinung. Die Frau Lagarde sagt ja, bis Mitte nächsten Jahres haben wir das alles überwunden. Ihr Wort in Gottes Ohr. Ich warte erst mal Mitte des Jahres ab. Ich bin schon froh, wenn die Pandemie im Griff ist. Sie glauben gar nicht.
Well, here she is herself, the ECB president, Madame Lagarde, talking about inflation at a press conference in Germany.
Let's look at inflation. Inflation increased to 3.4% in September. We expect it to rise further this year. But while the current phase of higher inflation will last longer than originally expected, we expect inflation to decline in the course of next year.
In the UK, however, where the country is facing record inflation reaching a 10-year high, there is a case or two of denial among politicians in that country.
Growth up, jobs up and debt down. Let there be no doubt our plan is working.
We can squeeze in one more country to this segment, and that's Brazil, which is experiencing record food inflation. Brazilians are watching out for what they are eating since food inflation is ravaging the country, especially when it comes to essentials like meat.
Bom, a inflação ela tem provocado algumas alterações no consumo de alimentos na minha casa, então substituindo um pouco da carne vermelha por feijão branco, ovos. Eu vejo uma diferença grande na conta de luz também, essa inflação.
But maybe the following is what is worrying the US and maybe the rest of the world, and it's the situation in China. If China's economy keeps stumbling, it won't just take down Beijing. The whole world will collapse with it. Things like an energy crunch, the Chinese mega developer Evergrande's $300 billion potential debt default, and delays in factories shipping out products are some examples that are keeping many around the world awake at night. That does it for this segment of the program. Please send us any questions or comments. We do appreciate it. Our contact information is on your screen.
All right, what you're seeing behind me is the U.S. national debt. It's really unbelievable when you take a look at these figures. I mean, you can see how much money the U.S. has actually been pumping into its economy. I mean, from quantitative easing to anything else you really want to call it, the U.S. continues to make up for its economic shortfalls through this method. We explained what happens when money is printed and then flooded into the system that creates inflation. Well, maybe time has run out for the U.S. to tame its inflation due to post-COVID turbulations. But, as many experts have said, this debt will at some point catch up to the U.S. That does it for this edition of the program. It was great having you with us. We do appreciate any comments or questions that you sent to us. From Mikobe Tarvei and the entire team is goodbye until the next program.